Okay. All right, so you are here for FCI Live Series February 2022, and this session is You Don't Need Volunteers. And this emerged from working with our peer groups. If you're one of our peer groups, big shout out to the Crimson peer group. Oh, did I skip? I did, I accidentally skipped those. Okay, so real quick, housekeeping, please do mute. If you're not speaking and you're not speaking, unless I said, hey, it's time to unmute, you can ask questions, please be on mute. It really affects quality issues. And of course we are recording, and this recording will be available to startups for years to come. So it'd be lovely if everyone muted. The call is being recorded. And everyone asks this again and again and again. So I'll keep saying it. All the videos will be available on Monday, February 28th. We'll put them all up on the same day. They will go on the FCI YouTube channel. We will have a special, what's that called? We'll have a set just from this series. We will be promoting it on social media. We'll send it out to everyone who registered. You will find the videos. If your co-op happens to be one, and I've heard this from one or two, we're like, oh my God, we have a meeting and this topic, like we have to have everyone watch this video this week. Just email me and I can get you prior access if it's really, if it's something like, I'm having a volunteer meeting this week and this is just perfect. Okay, if you can't wait till the 28th, we understand, just let us know. But I won't have time to kind of put them all up in mass until then. Okay, so I invite you to heavily use the chat function. It will not distract me if I'm presenting and I answer a question and then like 5 of you have an answer for that question. Go ahead and throw it in the chat, have conversations, share links, do your thing, okay? Whatever you want to do with that. And again, I think someone's not muted and I'm not going to have time to monitor that heavily. So please, if you are here in the session, please mute, okay? Would really deeply.
I'm not.
Nope. Okay, I'm going to have to take a minute and mute somebody because I can hear it coming through. Okay, see if I can find who it is. Okay, so please stay on top of that. And then we're going to jump into the session once I just make sure everybody's muted. I have not yet figured out the art form of being on top of that and presenting. Okay. Alrighty, let's get going. Again, you're at FCI Live. You don't need volunteers. We're going to jump into the whole question of what volunteers are. Do we really need them? What do we need instead? Oh, cool. Who said that? Someone said Matthew. Okay. I am going to take just a second and make one of y'all who offered my co-host, so you can take care of muting anyone if we have sound issues. I just love that idea. Don't know why I hadn't thought of that before. Make co-host. All right. Thank you to Matthew for Chicago Market, who's now my co-host, and we'll be muting if anybody forgets to mute and possibly letting people in if there are last minute people coming in. Appreciate that. Okay. All right. So first off, I'm going to ask you, we're actually going to do a poll. Does right now, at this moment, in your co-op's organizing, does your co-op need more volunteers? Here's your poll. Let me know. All right, answers pouring in. 20, 35, 28. All right. Wow, more answers pouring in. Okay, gonna go ahead and lock that poll up and share results. Actually, guys, in a way, I'm really impressed. I expected a lot more in the desperately category, although we have some significant numbers there. And that sometimes most often comes from earlier organizing groups. We could use a lot more. We could use a few more. Nobody has said, nah, we don't need any more volunteers. So that's what I expected. Probably the most common thing I hear when talking to you all is we need more people, more capacity. Where do we find people? We need more volunteers. The question we're going to address today is volunteers really what you're looking for? And could that, using that term and thinking that way, could that be part of the challenge? So let's first dive into what a volunteer is. We use volunteer to cover a whole lot. when discussing startups. We talk about ourselves, right? As board members, we're volunteers. We tell everybody, even your board is volunteer. We're looking for volunteers to help us with this. We need volunteers for our committee. We need volunteers. But what is a volunteer? And this came up when talking to a bunch of the peer co-ops, as I said. We realized that the word volunteer in the public mind, when you volunteer for something, when's the last time you volunteered? If you picture something, the last time I volunteered was at our local Pride Festival this summer, and this past late fall or early fall, and I signed up. There was a way to sign up. I could see the slots that were available. I signed up for it. I showed up. I got an email the day before reminding me that I was going to volunteer and where to meet them and what I would need to bring. I showed up to that location. There was somebody with a t-shirt for the organization who met me, who gave me information and instructions, who told me what I would be doing. And that shift lasted about, I think that one was 3 hours, which is usually about maximum for a volunteer. And somebody actually met me at the end and met the new person coming in and thanked me for my time. It was a very curated, organized experience. There was a clear set task. I knew exactly what it was. I didn't have to be constantly involved in the organization to know how to do it. There was a very easy way to sign up that was clean and organized. I got reminders. I didn't have to do the mental processing to remember that I agreed to do something. I was reminded I agreed to do something and exactly when and where I needed to be. All the information I needed to do that task was on the table. I was signing in people who were in the parade, and I had my different little worksheets, information sheets. I knew who to text if something went wrong and I couldn't find someone on the information sheet. I needed a little more information. I had everything I needed. There was a load of pens. I didn't have to remember to bring a pen. It was there for me to do. And ideally, again, there was someone there with more info. I had access to somebody with more info because I was doing a volunteer shift. I wasn't usually involved, and I didn't know a lot, actually, about the underpinnings of how this event was going to work, or even what this org was consistently doing outside of this one event. So I had to put in a set amount of time. I knew when to show up. I knew when to leave. And I knew that before I signed up. I knew exactly how much time they were asking of me. I could consider if that shift worked for me. I could consider if I could give up that much time. And I even could have written them and said, I can't give up that much time. Is there something else I could do? And they would have slotted me in there. So, and I was not obligated to ever volunteer again. I volunteered once. I knew it meant I'd probably get a few more emails from this organization once I'd shown willingness to volunteer. But I knew just because I volunteered once didn't mean they were going to expect me to keep volunteering and to fill in gaps for them. And I did expect to at least feel a little appreciated and thanked. In this case, I was given a t-shirt from the organization. Not always my favorite, can be pretty wasteful, but more importantly, somebody was there to help me out and to thank me at the end. That's a volunteer experience. When nonprofits talk about we have opportunities for volunteers when you go volunteer for something, it's a very organized, curated experience. I know exactly what's needed. I know exactly what to do. I have the support I need. And I have the sense it's important that despite the fact I'm kind of coming in with very little knowledge or skill set as far as they know, they don't even know if I'm good with people and being plugged in to do something that technically almost anyone could do. We just kind of need bodies. I could tell it was something important, that it was something that really needed to happen and that I was helping the organization out, even though all I was doing was committing to a very small amount of time and I didn't have to have any really particular unique skill set to do the work. When we say volunteer, this is what people think. Volunteer experiences, at least in the US, are very curated. Volunteers do actually ultimately a very small portion of the work for any given organization in general. So we're kind of confusing people when we ask for volunteers, and I'll point out why in a minute. So great volunteers just don't just happen. To get a star volunteer, who does great. Let's say you've got a person who consistently signs up for shifts at your farmer's market to table, which is the place we most use volunteers usually as startups. Awesome. And you've got this person who's awesome at it. Occasionally that happens on a fluke because they're actually an organizer. We'll talk about the difference later. But generally, if you want to have a star excellent volunteer who does a great job, who signs up repeatedly to help out, comes back in again and again, you've built this whole infrastructure to hold them up to be successful. You've got a clear plan about how you're going to utilize them that is necessary and important. You have got a volunteer coordinator, someone who's going to communicate with them. You have all the materials, you've built all the materials they need to do their work, and you've thought about it before them. A lot of food co-ops, startup food co-ops, have a go box. It's a plastic bin that has all the pens, the pamphlets, the forms, anything they could need to do that task. That took a bunch of work that had to be created for them. They don't know what they're going to need and they don't have access to all of it. And then clear instructions. We have to build this entire foundation of all these things to then get a star volunteer. Now, I'm not saying volunteers aren't valuable. We're going to talk about that. They're valuable for specific certain types of tasks. They're not necessarily, you're like, well, that sounds like a lot of work, but they can be extremely valuable under the right conditions, but you have to create all of those right conditions. So I'm figuring a lot of people's response to that is pretty much like, oh my God, we need help and capacity now. We don't have, we can't, where are we going to come up with all the energy to build all that, to build all of those foundational pieces? Well, let's first take a nice deep breath, head to the chat if you're not on your phone. What kind of stuff right now does your co-op need help with? Anything and everything from, we need more board members, we need someone to run our newsletter, we need people to join our capital campaign team. Just pour it out. I want to just dump it all in the chat. What would your co-op need help with right now? What we got? Capital campaign callers, social media, all of it. Everyone's all of the above, all the above. Going to community events for us, socials, running socials, admin work. Oh, that's a great one. Grant writers. We need more board members, event planning, marketing and recruiting. We need directors. We also need capital campaign volunteers, organizing people to speak at community groups, to carry out tasks for business development, board members, bylaw committee, member growth and outreach, marketing. All right, keep it coming. More outreach, events, admin, fundraising, all of it, as far as I can tell, Peggy. Definitely more strategic thinkers and system-focused developers. We're gonna get to some of that. Marketing, board members, people to host booths. Yeah, hosting booths at events. Cool. All right. So the gambit, we need a lot. And the idea of having to build a very clear infrastructure with lots of these pieces just to get to the point that we can ask someone to volunteer. I'm absolutely certain that a lot of you feel like, but that's the problem. We don't have the people with the capacity to build that infrastructure. Wait a minute, if volunteers need all of that, how is this going to work? Someone said, oh yeah, even collecting information on potential vendors to see it, local food vendors to see if they want to work and if they want to sell stuff in the store. I mean, we just need people to go out and do the stuff. But I just told you volunteers won't be successful if you just say, hey, we need you to go out and do the stuff. We need to create all this infrastructure of all this work. So how does this get resolved? Volunteer recruitment. I love that page. It's like, we need a volunteer to recruit volunteers, right? Like, it just sounds like a freaking lot when I say, yeah, and the only way you're really going to have a meaningful, effective volunteer base and really attract good numbers of new volunteers is to have all of these systems in place. And that kind of sounds like a little bit of a nightmare, right? because we have to get capacity, we have to use capacity. How does that work? All right. Well, the thing is, you may not need volunteers. You may need organizers. This is something I wish we had realized years ago in the startup community. And again, I want to give full credit. So much of the innovation and learning and better practices that come along come from the thought processes of the people actually in the trenches doing the work, which is yourselves. That is what happened here. We actually had a bunch of people. Our Crimson group is early stage 2A development, so they haven't necessarily been at it forever. But we were discussing this thorny problem of volunteers when we realized we're potentially asking for the wrong thing, right? We need organizers, not volunteers. Maybe you might need both. You do need both eventually. But what's an organizer? We came up with a working definition as a group. We said, this is a co-op owner who takes responsibility and/or leadership for a specific piece of work that needs to get done then they have there's definitely oversight and accountability because they've been delegated some authority to get something done, but there's limited to no supervision needed. And so what we mean by that is we don't necessarily need to be like in a volunteer position. It's like, hey, Jonathan just showed up for a shift. Hey, Jonathan, hey, did you sign in? This is where you find the clipboard papers. And I want to make sure you know that Kiana's coming to take over from you at 2 p.m. and making sure they're doing it all right. And then you get the list of emails and you let people sign up to say they're interested in the co-op or even become owners. And they made a bunch of errors and we have to go back and fix them. And there's all this supervision that is necessary for them to get their work done. An organizer is someone who, it can be big or small, but can take responsibility for a set piece of work within the organization and with a little bit of guidance, execute and actually be accountable to someone, usually directly to the board, someone on the board, letting them know this is what I'm working on, this is what I got done. So you're actually delegating real responsibility of some sort for the co-op's needs. And remember, all of the co-op's needs to get developed, to grow ownership, to go through its business development, to open its store, that is all the board's. The board is elected by the owners. It's your responsibility to make their co-op move forward in a way that is sound and successful and get all these tasks, figure out what the tasks are needed to get it done and to make sure they get done. But you can delegate just about anything that isn't a governance responsibility. And there's lots of delegation that does happen, right? Some of you have paid staff, some of you have committee leaders who can really run their whole committee. You might have, a site selection team that's a bunch of people who really know what they're doing, and you've delegated a lot of authority to them to do a bunch of research, information collecting. You've delegated. If you want to delegate a responsibility and just have a person who, as I like to say, gets bleep done and just reports back to you on how it's going, lets you know if they need something, you're talking about an organizer. You're not talking about a volunteer. But we keep using this volunteer language, and this mistake came from the very root of about those of us who've been coaching you guys for years and for co-ops who've been doing it. But we don't need volunteers, we need organizers. And it doesn't matter how small or big the piece that we're delegating is, if they can actually execute without you having to provide much supervision or oversight, just need parameters on what they're allowed to do, when they need it done by, check in with you if they need anything, then we're talking about an organizer. And what we found we actually discussed this topic over multiple months in the Crimson group. And what we found is that, wow, volunteers and organizers, when we started to sort people who help the co-op, we found those people in very different ways. They're attracted different ways, and we set them up for success different ways. Patient is like, what about volunteer organizers? Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you, Roberta. Just like organizers are volunteers too. Yeah, they're donating their time. So I hear what you're saying. We don't want it to sound like they're getting paid. But I think there's some value in separating out organizer from volunteer, at least in your internal mind, and maybe in how you frame this with people. I do hear what you're saying. We'll get a little bit more with that. And I will say also, this is something new that we're hearing a lot of positive response to it, but that we're starting to launch out there. Not sure how much we should use this specific language externally, but it's definitely critical. It's critical language internally for the leadership of the co-op to understand the difference and understand what they're looking for. And then, of course, Paige, who is a smart bleep, what about volunteer organizers, right? The person who organizes your volunteers, though, right, is an organizer. But yes, the word volunteer gets involved. So we've got a little bit of a frame. Oh, for maybe these two things are different. I want to play a little game here in your own minds. We're going to go through each of these. Board members, are they volunteers or organizers? Those are clearly organizers. They take on responsibility and authority for a lot in the co-op, but for something specific, and they execute to it. They are accountable to each other, to the full board and to the owners. So work has been given and delegated to them by the owners in this case, and they have accountability and responsibility for it, and they can do it mostly self-directed. If you have board members who cannot take on self-directed pieces of work and report back to the board, you have a volunteer board member, not an organizing board member. Different problem, we'll talk about that some other time. We've all had them and have them. Tabling at the farmer's market definitely can be made into a volunteer position. Although a lot of us are using organizers to table at the farmer's market. Is that the best use of an organizer? Not necessarily. No, we could talk about that some. Yeah, this is a really interesting point. I do want to come back to this in the chat. So Matthew has said from Chicago, well, sometimes we struggle with putting on that hat when as a board member, as a core organizer of the co-op, you're volunteering for something. Sometimes that's just all you're doing, even if you also have other responsibilities, for sure. But one of the things we can think about too is we're starting to think about volunteer versus organizer. We want, whenever possible, to not utilize an organizer to do a volunteer's job. And this is a really interesting learning that came from talking to some of the groups. We can do it. We have to at some points. And the earlier you are in your co-op's development, the more you are using board members and core organizers to do volunteer level tasks, because that's who's available. And because to some degree, you're still figuring out and formulating what that is. Like tabling at the farmer's market isn't just a show up, open the box, put the stuff out, you have these talking points. We're still figuring out what we need and how we put new owners into the iPad. And so it's not yet quite a volunteer responsibility, but it can easily be there. And we want to avoid our work. It's never going to be completely avoidable, but our work, especially as we develop, as we get into like late stage 2A and to 2B for sure, we want our organizers out of our volunteer jobs. We're going to talk more about that also. Yeah, good point. Paige has brought up too. So since the pandemic, we have found that a lot of our organizers have to be the volunteers because we had maybe you're further along and we had some good volunteer work opportunities structured, but most of those were in person volunteer responsibilities. And so you built this structure for volunteers and now you don't really have a way to plug them in. Sometimes that definitely happened with the changes after COVID. And then other people, yes. And then there were just a lot of life changes that people had during COVID for sure. So some people who used to volunteer don't anymore. Although we also have found a lot of people who didn't used to volunteer are now volunteering. Everybody's had different kinds of life changes. Newsletter editor, that'd be an organizer. That's somebody who, even if their only job is to know when the articles will come in and edit them, and then let the person who does the layout know they are edited, they are done. They took on a specific task. They can execute it. They can communicate to okay, I need your articles by here. Okay, they're edited. Hey, layout person, they're done. They can handle it on their own with very little supervision. They'll let you know if they need anything. That's an organizer. Even though maybe they only have that one, maybe literally, and when I mean editor, maybe all they're doing is editing copy. They're not laying it out. They're not even deciding what articles to have, but they still have an independent job, a task for the co-op that they are able to take almost full responsibility for with no oversight. That's still an organizer. That's someone who took responsibility for something and got it off your plates as a board, right? Social media lead, that's an organizer. We don't want random volunteers who don't know what's going on at the co-op and don't have a very specific skill set. This person's taking a lot of authority on for your organization. Event table help should be a volunteer. That one definitely should be a volunteer gig, if at all possible. We're going to talk about how to turn things into volunteer gigs. Leader of your info sessions. Now this one I left with not an arrow, because actually, if you have a clear structure, let's say we have some startups, and I think it's lovely, that have monthly info sessions, online info sessions. Anyone who's curious can stop by. It's a quick 30-minute event. They go over what the co-op is. They answer questions. You have to have a lot of information about the co-op. But honestly, eventually, this is something that could be structured into something a volunteer does. Someone who just is really excited about the co-op, but maybe isn't involved in a lot of the decision making or any committees, but just, you know, it's like, I can lead an info session. I've attended a few. I know what it could be. Setting it up, figuring out what you want to do with it, that would be an organizer's job. But you could possibly find some key volunteers who take turns doing your info sessions. It is possible. Data input assistant totally could be a volunteer gig. And there are lots of people who find it relaxing. I know it's hard for some of us to believe, but find it relaxing to just enter a bunch of data. And there's lots of times that comes up. Door-to-door canvassing. If you're going to do a canvassing event, yes, you can collect volunteers. There'll be an organizer with them who knows what's supposed to happen, who can answer tough questions and so forth. But of course, you can use volunteers to do a lot of that with you. Committee chairs are organizers. People who sit on committees, depends on the committee. If it's an outreach ownership committee, a lot of them will be volunteers, maybe some key volunteers that know a little more, but don't have necessarily independent authority and responsibility for any particular thing. But your committee chairs absolutely are organizers. They've taken over a whole body of responsibility. They're supposed to keep these people getting stuff done and then reporting back to the board how things are going, letting them know what they need. That's an organizer. Some serious authority has been delegated. All right, I see some stuff in the chat here. Okay, great. We need sales and marketing people. All right. Yep. And people who can sell the co-op, you're like, those are organizers, right? Sometimes there are some terrific people who can really sell your co-op. Again, like for info sessions that are board members that run committees. But I've actually seen people with this skill set who would love to do it as a volunteer only. We had a startup that they had a board member who, she'd been a board member, she stepped down, she didn't have anywhere near that kind of time, she was retired. Her and her spouse were traveling a great deal. They were rarely in town, but my goodness, could anyone sell the co-op as well as this woman? You know, those people who just, they're everyone's new best friend the first time they talk to you, and they have no shame about telling you how excited they are about something and asking you to sign up. She made a terrific volunteer. She wasn't, as the years went on, she didn't necessarily know everything that was going on. She did ask for key information she felt she needed, but she could run her info sessions from whichever country she was in, and she was terrific at it. So the people who can sell the co-op, the framework of the language we use, how we'll sell the co-op, that's some organizer level deciding, but then executing, sometimes that's a volunteer gig. All right. So let's first take a look at tasks and what tasks could be turned into volunteer roles. Some tasks cannot be. So let's first questions to ask yourself. Can we break down this task into a 2.5 hour or less commitment? Maybe 3, but can it be broken into like little chunks rather than a who knows how much time it's going to take to do this week and you're just responsible to get it done? Can we break it down into set amount of commitment of time? Can we create clear instructions for the steps to follow? For data entry, yes, you can. For running a table, yes, you can. Maybe for helping set up an event, you don't, but your organizers will be there guiding the volunteers, so we don't need that. But can you provide an organizer or clear instructions to help those people implement their task effectively? And then let's look at, can you create a toolkit with everything they'll need? in it. Sometimes that toolkit is digital. If there's someone who maybe puts in a bunch of your new owners or just sends out the new owner packet, they'll just need to know where to go to look up all the new owners and the addresses if you send out a physical packet or an email one, and get the email or the physical address, write it on there or put it in the email system. They'll just need the steps. I take the names from here, I put them in the email system, and then I attach this packet with this note. Done. That could be a volunteer responsibility then, even though there's an organizer who will probably be running the process of integrating new owners through the system. They could delegate some of that work to a volunteer. We could make that into a volunteer role. You have to provide training. Can you do that? Who would do that? Please don't make something a volunteer role and then offer no training, because what you have done is set them up to fail. Deeply frustrating, and set them up to screw it up. Deeply frustrating when you have to go clean it up afterward. So you have to have capacity for that if it's going to be a volunteer role. And who would be responsible for their work? Any work that's been delegated, that's been given to a volunteer, has to be overseen by an organizer, somebody with more knowledge and authority who is willing to take on that authority and execute it. Who would that volunteer report to? Because they'll need someone to report to who can be responsive. If you can meet those things, it could become a volunteer role. Is it worth? I wrote, is it work turning? Is it worth is what I meant. It will be work turning anything into a volunteer job, but it can be worth it. Is it worth it? Is it a task that needs doing repeatedly? If it needs doing repeatedly, you train you on it once, and then you can pretty much just keep doing it, and we'll need to keep doing it for a period of time in our co-op. Probably worth taking the time and energy to turn it into a volunteer job. If a system is created to support it, would it take significant time demands off one or more organizers in your group to free them up to do something they're more specifically needed for? If taking the time and energy to create the supports to make something a volunteer role would really, in the long run, free up some of your organizing team, then it's worth turning into a volunteer role. Okay, back to the chat. What are some tasks currently at your co-op? Now, you don't know saying you have the time and capacity and you're going to do it, but that you could see turning into a volunteer role. Take it to the chat, please. What is something that needs to get done at your co-op that you could definitely turn into a volunteer responsibility with the right time to get that together? Great. Sue from Riverside said we could use volunteers to be just doing, contacting owners. A lot of you have started doing phone trees a couple times a year just to keep owners engaged. Absolutely. We could train volunteers to do it. There's a lot of repetitive work to be done in that process. Great volunteer role. Entering new owner data into our spreadsheet. Yes. You got an organizer doing that, Katie says. Yep. Right? Like there's kind of like an aha when you realize, like, I got somebody with organizer ability levels and they're doing data entry. That could become a volunteer role. We've used volunteer teams recently to help provide feedback for updates on our written materials. Yeah, and that's a one-time, that's a one-off. That's a fun one when you actually utilize volunteers to give you feedback on something. I love that. Database cleanup, absolutely. If someone has the skill set, although that might kind of turn into an organizer. I'm going to argue that's kind of, because it's a responsibility that takes certain skills and it does have a certain level of authority to just execute once they understand your database. So, but I hear what you're saying. Absolutely. Doesn't have to be one of your core volunteers, that's for sure. Someone who calls owners, for sure. What else am I missing here? Contacting owners, updating addresses. Yes, posting daily social media content. If there's already a social media calendar where you have the content in the image, just posting it, or taking the week's post and putting them and setting the date and time you want them to go live. Yeah, they could do that. Now, deciding what those posts are gonna say, how we're gonna word it, so forth. That's an organizer. They're representing the organization. They're taking on a lot of responsibility for figuring out how to use the co-op's voice and what needs to be talked about. We were starting a site search and we could use a coordinator. Site search coordinator would definitely be not a volunteer, an organizer. That would definitely, that's someone who's going to have some authority over some folks to make sure they're getting their stuff done. Canvassing, yes, Louisville, absolutely. Great place to utilize them. Speaking of community groups, yeah, Eric, I would agree. People are sometimes like, oh, again, like we need a board member who can go speak at this, or do you need to put together kind of a set outline for how you guys go speak at community groups and find a couple key volunteers who are willing, like 3 or 4 people who are willing to be on a little email, you know, like, hey guys, we got another opportunity, who can take it? And they've been trained how you guys do your presentations. They could even take a new person who's interested in doing presentations with them and do it, you know, kind of like be their guide the first time, but then that person can execute on their own. Those could be volunteers. Someone has to organize them. You got to figure out who that's going to be. But absolutely, your speakers could be volunteers. One of the challenges of turning tasks over that the board organizer is doing is reliability. Cool if others will do it, but what happens if they don't? Right. So is it worth it category, I'd add, can you survive if it doesn't happen? Ooh, I like that, Matthew. See, new wisdom being added to this understanding right here, right now. Needed to be added to the is it worth it category. Can you survive if that volunteer doesn't show up or doesn't do it? Handling t-shirt inventory, yes, absolutely. Okay, that's cool, not answering the current question. Some level of project management on track. Also keeps documents up to date to the board as a sense. Okay, I would actually, yeah, I see what you're saying. Project management, I think that's pretty organizer-ish, even if they're not at the level of the board. But I have seen actually the boards have volunteers, owner volunteer who takes notes at the board meeting and then files them in the right place and lets the board just talk. That could be a phenomenal use of a volunteer. It's something you can train someone to do or know they have the skills to do. They just do that one thing. It's a set amount of time. They go home. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Excellent. Okay, you guys are getting it. I am hearing it. Awesome. So those are some of the things you guys have talked about that could be turned into volunteer roles. And again, anything with data entry, anything that do with showing up at events, anything that is repetitive, you can find a volunteer to do, but it shouldn't take a specific skill set. If it takes a very specific skill set, then they're still taking a level of authority kind of consistently. They're still an organizer. They're taking a significant piece, even if it's a smaller chunk of work, off your plate, and you know they have the knowledge and ability to just execute. You didn't train them to be an editor. They're already a good editor, right? We're not going to train random volunteers to be an editor of the newsletter. So do you have to train people to do it, or you just have to give them a little information and tools and let them loose? Then we're talking about an organizer. Of course, not an organizer on the same level as a board member. I get that, but they still are taking responsibility for a whole area of work and taking it off your plate if you're an organizer. So we're going to talk just for a minute about attracting organizers. Checking my time. Some things, we had this big conversation again in Crimson Group, some things that we talked about. Who do you have organizing? What do they do? Where did you find them? And we literally just shared notes. Like, is it random? What do we know about organizers? One thing we did find out is consistently, they don't come from this. No one got them consistently from the same place. No one. All sorts of different things. But the number one thing that led to more potential organizers finding the co-op was visibility. Everyone was talking about it. It was at an event. It was, one co-op said, we had a slide up at the local nonprofit movie theater about the co-op and how to contact us. And we've gotten multiple organizers out of that. People who didn't really know we existed, who had time to just sit there and stare at the slide, look us up, who ended up becoming organizers. A lot of you're gonna say we are super visible. We've been, we're in stage 3. We've been, but if you're in earlier stages, do check your level of visibility in the community. People got new organizers who's like, oh, we found you through a yard sign. Also, a large portion of organizers were people who had moved to the community in the last year and a half. People who were looking for new and exciting ways to plug in, who didn't already have all of like their ducks in a row of like, these are the people I hang with and these are the orgs I'm involved with and I have more than I can do. A lot of it was new people in the community who were like, oh, that sounds like it aligns with my values. I could get involved with that. And that is why the visibility thing became critical. The more places people could run into your message, the more those new people could find you. Okay. Have a plan. This was the other key thing. We're organizers. Everyone on this call is an organizer by personality. So we know this. You can tell pretty quickly if there is an actual plan or if you're dealing with an org that is desperate and disorganized, right? Because you've tried to plug in and help at orgs and gone, oh God, oh my God, either I have to take over and create some order or I just have to deal with chaos. And organizers aren't attracted to that. Organizers want to know that there's a plan that they're becoming a part of. We found that talking about what the co-op is working on and showing there is a plan helped attract more organizers. A lot of the people said that organizers they had that came to them, and quite often the organizers approached them, were like, oh, I heard you guys are working on this, or that you have this coming up. This is something I have the skill set for, but they could see where they plugged in. So we talked about how it may seem like the least important and boring stuff, putting out what the board's working on, what are some of our goals this summer, because people want to go, when are you going to just name the site, when you're going to open? And that's what, gets all the likes, is when you talk about those things. But when you do say, hey, a big part of growing our co-op this year is, or your board got together, here's a picture of us, this weekend, and built our work plan for the next 6 months. And here are some of the key things we'll be working on, or here are some of our top goals for this year. Organizers hear a planful organization, that there's people in charge, that if they show up, they're not going to suddenly be made board president. I know some of you who are on this call have had people show up as volunteers and within 3 months they're board president. I know it has happened with some of you, and organizers kind of sense that coming, and they want to be part of an org that at least has some kind of plan that'll allow them to plug in, but not overwhelm them. And we're going to get in a little more into that. There's a comment here. I suggest to, no matter what stage you're at, you tend to talk to the same people over and over. So true. That's a whole different workshop, but yes, visibility, consistent visibility is about being visible somewhere that your core is not. So yard signs, that slide at that movie theater, where could you be visible that isn't just the exact same audience over and over again? Very good point. Lindsay is like, yeah, that's my story. There's another co-op on this call who's board president. I don't think he's the president here, but I know the co-ops here who same story. So it's not uncommon. I showed up to volunteer and suddenly I was president. But in general, most people who have the skills to be organizers are pretty put off by that sense that they're going to get thrown in. They want to know you have a plan and they'll get plugged in to utilize what they do well. Other thing that we all talked about was courting. The other hat was kind of like, there are people who just found us, and a lot of them were new to the community. And then there were the people that showed interest in the co-op, and we noticed it. One person in our call said, this person just started liking everything we posted. I was like, who is this person? She bothered to find out. She kind of circulated the name amongst the board and says, anyone know who this is? Kind of figured out, where they were, what they did, and they reached out. A big thing, or someone shows up at a board meeting who's never shown up at a board meeting before and you don't know them. Can you follow up with them? They're going to share their name. Can you afterwards send them a quick note saying, hey, it was really great to have you at the board meeting. Thanks for taking so much interest in the co-op. And then you can add ... If you ever have 10, 15 minutes to talk about, what interests you about the co-op and give us some opinions on some things we're working on right now, I'd love to just talk sometime. This is not for everyone, I know, but when you do that, when you say, we'd just love to get your opinion or some thoughts on something, we've noticed you're kind of engaging with us, people almost never say no. And if you can get them on Zoom or phone or in person for 10, 15 minutes and ask them their opinion on a couple things, like, hey, how did you find the co-op? Why do you think other people maybe aren't? What would you do? Or, just some questions you could ask them about what they think about what the co-op's doing, and really give them room to be blunt and honest with you. People love to give their opinion and feel it's valuable. They'll do it. And that often leads to a much bigger conversation. And the fact that you noticed that they're kind of interacting with the co-op consistently, but all you asked for was, hey, can I hear your opinions? Oh, they noticed. Oh, but they're not gonna make me board president. They just want my opinion. it gives them time to kind of talk to you, get in relationship with you, hear about what you're working on, and maybe consider becoming an organizer. That was a really successful route for a lot of startups as well. But you gotta do the work. You gotta have someone who's got the availability, who, maybe they don't notice little people, but someone like, hey, did you notice so and so's been liking our post? Hey, did you notice that this person has shown up at 2 board meetings, and one was in January and one was in October, but it's happened twice now. And people know that they can go and tell that person, and that person will do the follow-up if you can create that. It's something that honestly is a really good role for the board chair if you can create enough room for them to do it. I'm going to jump to the chat before I go to the next slide. Strategies for talking in front of new people would be a good webinar. Okay. Personal asks are awesome. Yes, thrown in does not equal plugged in. I think that's going to have to become our key phrases for this, right? If you want, sometimes you guys, we had some start say, we did attract organizers and then they ran screaming. And we were actually pretty quickly able to identify themselves why they ran screaming. They're like, well, this person didn't work out at all. Like, well, did you give them what they needed to be successful? Did you plug them into what is going on and then give them a piece? Or did you throw them in? And we're like, oh, we threw them in. Or we expected the world from them. And it turns out they would have made a perfectly decent organizer on this level. They would have gotten something off your plate, but you needed help. And you were like, oh my God, they're amazing. They're a social media professional and they do marketing and they're just going to take it all over and fix it for us. Wah, wah, they're going to disappoint you. Most of the time, you're throwing way too much at them. You're expecting too much. You need to find out what they're capable of and get to know them. Don't outsize your expectations. And that leads us to some don'ts, some advice that came from the group. Desperation reeks. This was a quote directly from one of your fellow organizers. We can smell it a mile away, and we know it means walking into overwhelming chaos. No matter how desperate you are, don't be grabby, be planful. So even though we're desperate, even if you're like, oh my God, we have 3 board members left and we have so much to do, and if you approach people from that place, you will stay 3 people. You're going to have to find it in you to approach them in a calm, planful way and figure out what capacity they can give you. Don't dump. We've talked about this. Don't dump a huge amount of authority on them right away. And what's the number one thing not to ask someone who seems to have organizing capacity to do right away? Be a board member. You can ask them that after they've been plugged in and are doing a great job for like 3 months and they feel like they're part of the org. They feel like, I've got this, I'm part of this. I've decided to stick around and help out with this thing. I'm kind of part of this co-op effort. Then we can start to drop some hints about joining the board, but let them get established for at least 3 months. Even longer would be great before you start throwing at them. I have seen people say, we've got this new volunteer and I'm going to bring them to the next peer call. And they come to the peer call and they're like, this is our brilliant new volunteer in front of everyone, which they find a little embarrassing. And then they're like, and we're really hoping she'll join the board. And you're just like, and some of those people don't come back because they're like, oh my God, you have a secret agenda for me. And they can see, again, the desperation that you're going to dump at me. Make sure you right size when they do show up and show firm interest. Ask them how much time they think they can spare for the co-op. So this is important to ask them. This shows respect for their boundaries. You're like, well, the co-op doesn't show any respect for my boundaries. Wait, that's later. But a lot of times you can get those mid-level organizers much better if you realize they may or may not step up to a board level later. But right now, what do they feel they have they can give you? And I don't just mean talent. They'll be happy to talk about that. How much time do they feel like they could put in? And respect that. Say, okay, based on that, this is what we think. This is a great place for you to plug in. And they may offer to do more overtime. They probably will if they're enjoying themselves, but don't give them make sure that they sense you're respecting their time, at least at first. And intro period, last one. There were a decent number of stories about people who are like, they have so much potential and we just put them in charge of our entire outreach. And you're like, and even better, they said yes, and they have a million ideas. I'm going to tell you that is at least a yellow flag, if not a red. Because what often comes, they come in with a whole lot of ideas, but they don't know anything about the org yet. And they start doing, and they start taking over. And sometimes they don't even have the talent, experience, and abilities to do what they think they want to take over. people who don't tend to come in and say, I'll just take it all over. Make sure you kind of think of it as an intro period, that you keep an eye on them, that you don't hand them full authority for something large without any oversight right away. Okay, so those are some things to watch out for. Before opening, Cheryl asked, is this the same strategy before opening the co-op and after? Well, keep in mind, the vast majority of open co-ops don't use volunteers. Those that do, those are definitely volunteer roles. So the volunteer strategy is the same. Organizers, the organizing role is a little different. You're right there, because mostly the organizers after opening are board members. Occasionally a committee chair of a committee that the board launched. So you're more looking for volunteers. Has anyone put together that next committee for groceries in their store? Oh, I'm gonna let you guys talk about that in the chat. That's kind of outside the scope today. All right, and a final thought. About 1 in 3 people who indicate interest in being an organizer, is the other thing that really emerged, actually end up getting really plugged in and doing a strong job. People realized that they had gotten really discouraged by this over and over again. And then when we realized this is just a normal pattern, that helped. You can plan for that. You can realize on to the next one, not get discouraged because it's normal. Because it's like, what did we do wrong? Nothing really. Even when people step forward and say they want to help in a significant way, in an organizer level way, sometimes stuff changes. Sometimes they had the wrong expectations. Sometimes they realize you really need someone to just put up the social media posts, and they actually want to create messaging, and you kind of already have someone doing that. And they just don't want to do something else. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Don't take it super personal if they don't, and just realize it's part of the process. That shift to not come off desperate while in desperate times. Yes. I totally get it. You guys, sometimes you are in desperate times, but we have to make that shift to not talk from desperate times when we're trying to attract people. And I've had people say, how do you do that? Like, think of, at least be clear, like, this is what we're working on, even if it's like, we're working on growing the board this year and ownership growth and improving our social media. And you're like, and a 700 other things, but couple focus things, communicate that, and then plug people into those places that you do have the capacity to plug them in. Like, oh, I can help with the social media piece, or, oh, I can help with this. Don't plug them into the desperate pit of despair. They will eventually, some of them, move in and help you make that not a pit of despair. I promise, if you don't overwhelm them right away. All right, so any questions, less questions, thoughts, comments, advice you'd give now that you've thought this through and gone, oh, this is what's worked for us? Anyone have any last thoughts to share? Yeah, anything coming up? Okay. All right, quiet group. Last thought, I'm just going to say.
Can I add something here?
Yes, do.
One of the things that I guess frustrates me a little, and I find kind of interesting, is that many people who we recruit as volunteers or organizers don't want to do the thing that they are best at. They want to try new stuff. So, you know, I recruited someone who is a social media person for the business she works at, and she organizes social media all the time. And I recruited her, and I really worked hard on trying to get her involved because I wanted somebody to help with social media. And then she's like, but I do that for my everyday. I want to try doing something different. And she wants to help organize, you know, the like booths at events instead. And I find that really interesting, because I obviously was attracted to this person to do a specific thing that I saw that she was good at. And I wonder if there is, I mean, do people do job descriptions or things like that that could help with some of that?
Yes, although I'm interested if any peers have thoughts based on what was just shared. I will say that's it. Katie's got it. People, we don't get to decide what people are bringing, although, and that is common. You're like, oh my God, but this person is a real estate lawyer, you know, or whatever it is. but we know we're volunteering, we know we're donating our time, and we're looking for a certain kind of reward. We're looking for a certain kind of satisfaction. And often that is that we want to do something different than our day job. So I think the biggest thing is that two things with that. One is, like Katie said, let people shine at what they want to shine at least they're taking something off your plate, even if it's not what you hoped for. But two, in my mind, also is know what you need people to do. One thing I thought you might have been pointing to that I've also seen is people show up and want to do something we don't need done. Now, there's a difference between letting people shine at what they want to do and what they're good at, and letting them create a body of work that was not needed. Okay? So,
And I think I was kind of getting to that a little bit, that I, there
that's
was,
a different problem.
right.
Like, I want to create this. And you're like, and the response to that, and it takes some time and some skill, is basically, that's awesome. That's just not, we have these core things the co-op needs to work on right now, and that just isn't one of them. So if that's something you want to do in the future, if we have that opportunity, we can reach out, but I'd love to see you plug in here, here, or here. But we have to redirect folks and eventually even say no if the way they're organizing is creating more work for the core organization and taking capacity out of it. I don't know how many of you have had people come forward. Someone like even has like name recognition in the community and says, I want to teach a cooking class. We are not teaching cooking classes right now. Oh my God, we don't have capacity to run events right now. And you're like, but she runs this restaurant everyone knows. Great. Can she do a couple social media posts and send you some like text and a link to a recipe? And you can say, hey, this person's an owner, and picture of her in her restaurant and a link to her recipe. And you again say, you provide this, and then we can do this, but we're not ready for classes yet. Can you redirect them? Can you keep them? A lot of people are like, but this person's good at this. But does your co-op need it? Or did you just create a bunch more work? Because that's what'll happen. You're like, but the education program would be phenomenal. Great. Do you need it right now to engage your owners? Is it worth the investment of the overall organizational money, time, capacity, headaches when the volunteer doesn't show up to run it? Is it worth that? Because you really need to keep your owners engaged and to show them that you're executing on the mission even before the stores open, thumbs up. But if you already have a work plan for the next 6 months and there is no capacity to support that, even though it could be useful, the answer is no. Just you need to find the right way to phrase it. Yeah, someone said, has everybody experienced getting no organizer bites? Yeah, that has to happen in earlier organizing, especially no organizer bites. I know some of you have been through this, and we're at the top of the hour. So I will say we are at that point. I'm going to stop recording, but if anybody wants to stay, discuss this, share their experiences, give each other advice, you're very welcome to do that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks, everyone.